Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session of the Baltimore Council of Foreign Affairs. Our session this evening will be we'll have a briefing by Michael Kofman. The subject is the Russian-Ukrainian war in perspective after nearly 2.5 years of the war. It is our pleasure and honor to welcome Michael Kofman back to the SDG. Michael is a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He focuses on the Russian military and Eurasian security issues. Prior to joining Carnegie last year, he served as director of the Russian Studies program at the Center for Naval Analyses, where he conducted research on the capability, strategy, and military thought of the Russian armed forces. He remains a principal research scientist at CNA. Mr. Kofman also is an adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security and a contributing editor at War on the Rocks, where he hosts, quote, The Russian Contingency, a biweekly podcast of the Russian military and war against Ukraine. Mr. Kofman previously served as a program manager and research fellow at the National Defense University. Past fellowships have included Modern War Institute at West Point and the Keenan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Mr. Kofman last addressed us in May 2020 when he gave a riveting analysis of the Russian military's shambolic performance in the invasion of Ukraine, and that video attracted more than 20,000 viewers over the next several weeks after the briefing. This evening, Mr. Kofman will take a broader look at the war more than 800 days after the Russian invasion, to answer the question, what are Ukraine's prospects for recovering its territory now that U.S. military aid is resumed? And how much have the Russians improved their operations since the invasion? Once again, welcome back, Michael Kofman.
Okay, thanks for that kind introduction. I would say that right now the situation on the front line is quite difficult. It's not necessarily dire, but the picture is relatively gloomy. And this is probably the worst the military situation has been since around spring of 2022. Now, Russia at this stage holds the material advantages and the initiative along the front line, and that's been the case pretty much since October of last year. Ukraine's top priority right now is to stabilize the front, especially since Russia has launched a new offensive in Kharkiv across the border. But the challenge is also how to do this without compromising the plans to reconstitute the Ukrainian military, because there are trade-offs as Ukraine also needs to rebuild the force and put itself in a better position, or at least try to put itself in a position to try to retake the initiative next year. So third year in the war. Both militaries have been struggling with attrition, reconstitution, and defense industrial mobilization. They both lost large amounts of equipment and some of the best personnel. Neither army today looks the way it did when the war began. It's very common to assume when you've been watching the same war and the same two militaries fight over several years that you can base your expectations on past performance or what you've seen in previous phases of the war. That's not necessarily true. These armies evolve and change all the time, and the original forces that started the war, for practical purposes, are gone. They evolved significantly. A lot of the people have become casualties and what have you. Now, Ukraine right now is dealing with the accumulation of three significant problems that they need to address. The first one is manpower, particularly deficit of infantry, and that's been an issue since the end or the culmination of their offensive last fall. The second one is fortifications. Ukraine have started building fortifications earlier this year, but they are very much a work in progress. They've contracted as much of the work as they can as well to help speed it along. The Ukrainian forces are not entrenched nearly at the level that the Russian military was able to do last year, and there are reasons for that. The Russian military has dedicated units and forces that are specialized in construction of fortifications and entrenchments, and this is one area where Russia's had an advantage. All right. The third is ammunition. A lot of that has been due to the very long delay in material assistance from the United States. A part of that is also because Ukraine deals with a host of sustainment issues. It's using a lot of Western equipment where barrels have long worn past of service life, or some significant percentage of the equipment is always out of action under repair. Okay, all of these will take time to address. Most recently, last month, Ukraine has passed the requisite laws on mobilization, which have taken effect this month. They began building defenses several months ago. We finally passed a supplemental and have begun sending ammunition and equipment, but it will take some time to get to the front. These are recent developments. Ammunition is the easiest problem to address. It only takes us 2 weeks to send it. Manpower, given the hole that the Ukrainian forces have been forced to dig themselves into, is going to take the better part of this year to address, because it takes quite a bit of time to mobilize men, to train them, and to turn them into coherent units, or just to refill and replenish maneuver units on the front line. Now, the supplemental itself is not a magic wand. A lot of emphasis was placed on it before the vote. In practice, it buys time. It creates some certainty and confidence as to what are the resources that we and Ukrainians are going to be working with this year to enable actual planning and development of a strategy moving forward. And it creates the opportunity for Ukraine to potentially hold Russia to incremental gains this year, and it creates options to rebuild Ukrainian combat power. But I think the truth is that things are likely going to get worse before they get better, and the situation will be quite difficult through the course of this year till the winter, right? Ukraine still has to try to stabilize the front this summer, and there'll likely be more Russian offensives in the fall. If we turn to Russia, despite the fact that Russia has advantages in manpower and in equipment, and certainly in artillery, ammunition, and fires, okay, these advantages are not necessarily decisive. If they were, the Russian military would be advancing much further, would be achieving breakthroughs, would be able to exploit them, gain momentum. The Russian military is very much constrained in their ability to employ military power at scale. That is, most of these attacks are done at company level or company level and below. They lack the enablers to effectively overcome a prepared defense, the same challenge and problem that Ukraine was dealing with last year. And their overall advantage in fires is significant, but it's not crushing. It's nowhere near to the advantages that they enjoyed earlier in 2022. Now, these advantages also don't necessarily stack, right? Of course, much depends on what happens this year, and a lot comes down to forced employment and things you can't necessarily easily foresee or predict. But the Russian military has been burning through equipment at a fairly excessive rate. And much of the replacement equipment, they are pulling out of storage. That is their Soviet legacy, and they're steadily eating through the Soviet inheritance. And the truth is that they're already using much more dated equipment from storage facilities, but they are likely to have real shortages or problems as we get into 2025. Russian manpower generation has proven to be a significant advantage. They've been contracting anywhere between 20 to 30,000 men per month. That certainly was the case last year. And were able to establish a significant advantage in manpower, but this is probably the most they can generate without mobilization, which is something they clearly don't want to do and can't do that easily. Russia has a shortage of skilled labor. It's dealing with a lot of inflation. The economy is overheating. And the benefits that they're realizing from defense and industrial mobilization are likely to really begin leveling off this year. There's a host of macroeconomic issues that the Russian government has to balance and deal with. I'm happy to get into those if there are questions on them. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. But the point I want to make is that although on paper Russia has significant numerical advantages, they are not easily convertible into military power. And the manpower that exists on paper in most respects isn't available. And the equipment and the things you need to do to turn that into combat effective formations, that takes time. And that interacts with the rate of loss that they have on the battlefield. So this year most likely represents Russia's window of opportunity for major combat operations. That doesn't mean that Russia is going to run out of everything next year. They certainly won't. Okay, but that their advantage relative to their goals in this war is likely going to diminish. All right. If by the end of this year, Ukraine has stabilized its manpower situation, Ukrainian forces are entrenched, we not only have funding, but our capacity to produce artillery ammunition and other types of munition is increasing. It's actually going to be a lot better by 2025 than it is right now, then Russia's advantage will diminish. And here I'll conclude with a couple points on strategy. So, U.S. Western countries and Ukraine, I'm sure, are currently coordinating strategy and thinking through how best to help Ukraine try to hold Russia to incremental gains this year. That is the kind of gains that won't be decisive or won't have a strategic effect on the war, and to also regenerate Ukraine's offensive potential. And of course, what to build towards, what should drive those requirements, what are we building to? And that raises the question, what should the plan be? I don't think it is sound to try to refight the 2023 offensive, right? Those conditions no longer exist in reality, and the 2023 offensive wasn't successful to begin with. There's a fairly active and reasonable debate, and there are different views. On the one hand, it's difficult to see how, without an offensive, Ukraine can establish the leverage through military operations in order to achieve war termination on favorable terms, which has in many respects been the goal. Yeah, I'm being a bit reductionist, but at its simplest. On the other hand, another failed offensive will likely leave Ukraine worse off and vulnerable, and it could do more harm than good depending on how it goes. Right? So there's risk. And the question is, how can the West help Ukraine create sufficient advantage, establish a decisive advantage on the ground in order for any offensive operation to have a prospect of success? There's also a strong view out there that Ukraine is better off pursuing active defense well into next year rather than planning around major offensives, and instead expanding the strike campaign against Russian military, or that Ukraine should focus on, well, it's not an or, but essentially leveraging attrition and favorable attrition to deplete Russia of its offensive combat power. That's been my view in several articles written, I think, over the past year. The current position I've heard from DC, from Jake Sullivan publicly, had been that, we are planning around offensive in 2025. But I think it's clear to most that this right now is more notional or aspirational, and much depends on what's going to happen this year and the trade-offs that will be involved that Ukraine will have to make and that we will have to make in coordination with Ukraine. Okay, this is an unsatisfactory ending, but these are meant to be opening remarks to set the scene and to also explain some of the dilemmas and the issues, and as folks trying to think through a theory of success or theory of victory based on where we are. So I hope it's a reasonable enough opening for you. So relatively, it's not late, but it is an evening hour. So I'll stop here and save some time for Q&A and maybe turn it back over to my host.
Well, Michael, thank you very, very much. That was an outstanding overview. We appreciate that. Before I go to Chip Graber and the questions that we have received online, let me ask you the question that I asked about early on. It seems to me that a lot of, if not most of the opposition in the U.S. to supporting Ukraine is the belief that the Ukrainian government is riddled with corruption, and indeed that the society is riddled with corruption. Would you please comment on that?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of problems with that viewpoint, and I'll highlight them. So first, most of the assistance that is being provided to Ukraine does not actually go to Ukraine. A significant percentage of it, the majority, is spent here in the United States on replenishment at a much higher value of equipment that we send over to Ukraine, and on defense and production here in the U.S., right? So the supplemental, maybe a total of 89 billion, I think 27 or something like that is really earmarked for Ukraine. There was some percentage that was going to pay the salaries for Ukrainian government officials. Folks, of course, understand that Ukraine has taken a significant loss of GDP into its economy from this war, but it's just not true that most of the money is in fact going to Ukraine or flowing into Ukraine. It's totally not, it's most definitely not the way that we were conducting assistance or funneling money into countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, where people were coming off a plane with suitcases of cash. Second, yeah, it's true Ukraine has corruption issues, but I think these are grossly overstated, right? And I'm not making any excuses or alibis, but it's a much better partner, certainly compared to the other countries you worked in, like Iraq and Afghanistan, for one. It's not even remotely in that league. Two, Ukrainian civil society is actually the bright spot in Ukraine. Ukraine's main issues, less corruption and more weak state capacity, for which civil society and informal assistance try to compensate. But in general, I think the corruption challenges in Ukraine are grossly overstated, right? Ukraine has improved. If you look at Transparency International, look at any base rating that is typically used in assessing corruption around the world, Ukraine has improved significantly over the past decade. Certainly far better than it was in 2014, 2015, and had been on a relatively positive trajectory as well. Okay. So I think those issues are real, but I think they're grossly overstated. My own view, having spent time there and having gone to Ukraine and to the front lines several times a year over the past 2 years, I actually think that there's a great deal of accountability, and we will be fortunate to see accountability of that type in other militaries that we've partnered with and who we've supplied. Like Ukrainians, and part of the reason that is because there is such a pervasive awareness of the problem of corruption in Ukraine, right? The Ukraine organizations, Ukrainian military does its best to account for everything to almost a compulsive extent in terms of logging things and taking pictures and making and showing how they're using the money, right? I can't speak to the rest of the government. There are corruption issues in the Ukrainian government. That's true. I think they're being grossly overblown, and that Ukraine has, if you look, just in basic cost effectiveness, Robbie, the Ukrainian military has inflicted a very significant amount of damage on the Russian military relative to what we've actually spent at the most highest estimate of the amount of money that the United States spent on this war. And we would certainly not be able to achieve these kinds of effects against a major adversary if we had given this money to some of the previous partners to whom we've been giving money over the last 2 decades. Yeah, if you look at some of our prior wars. I hope this comparison makes sense.
It does, and I thank you very, very much for that. Chip, do you have a question from our virtual audience?
Yeah, I do. I actually have two, Robbie, if I can. The first one, Michael, is from Michael Conley. His question is, if peace broke out now and the national boundaries were set at the current state, do you think Putin would be satisfied long term, or would he later go after the remainder of the Ukraine and the other previous USSR states?
Okay, the short answer is no. I don't think he would be satisfied. I think that his minimal goal is to destroy Ukraine's viability as a state. If he's not able to control it, given the initial operation was principally externally imposed regime change, since he's not able to install pro-Russian regime there. And there's still clearly interesting regime change, because even most recently, his statements indicate doesn't see Zelensky as a legitimate leader, right? That at the very least to them, they're not even willing to deal with Ukraine's current political leadership. But at a bare minimum, I think the Russian view is that, and here it's obviously my own interpretation, is that if they're not able to control Ukraine, then they will try to break it, right? And the minimum territorial goals clearly seem to be, at the very least, taking the rest of the Donbass, right? And as much of the territory that he formally annexed in September of 2022. Folks forget that although Russia's being a bit obsequious as to what they actually annexed in the Constitution, it's not likely that if peace was to break out, it would be a lasting peace, if that makes any sense, right? If it broke out, I don't think there would be peace for long, and that in practice, peace would simply lead to another Russian rearmament period, and most likely a continuation war, which is what this war is. This war is a continuation war of the original 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thanks.
Michael, if I may, let me piggyback on that, and I'll go back to Chip for a follow-on question. From a Ukrainian perspective, let's say that it never becomes possible for Ukraine to regain all of the occupied territory. It will not be possible for it to regain all the occupied territory. If that were the case, what would be an acceptable level? How much of the occupied territory could Ukraine regain? Not all of it, but how much would be acceptable? Can you address that question?
Okay, so the honest answer is it's up to Ukrainians to decide. I don't know myself. I think right now, the public sentiment, as best I understand it, is that Ukrainians are not interested in making major territorial concessions to end the war. And for any Ukrainian leadership at this stage, it would probably be domestic political suicide in order to make them as part of an agreement. I also don't think that they're necessary, and I don't believe, meaning such concessions are necessary. I don't believe that they would actually gain much for Ukraine. Based on my previous answer, that I don't think it would really end the war, because this war isn't about who controls the next 20 kilometers of the Donbass, and that's not the center of gravity in it, right? To be perfectly frank, the Russian military advances another 20, 30 kilometers, yes, that would be unfortunate, but that's not the real strategic threat to Ukraine, right? And if the line shifts some more this year and some more back next year, that also won't settle the war. I think the issue is, first, how can Ukraine, again, achieve war termination into the war on favorable terms from a relative position of strength? Second, how can it resolve the commitment problem? Because no deal that they make with Russia, Russia's likely to stick to. And so for Ukraine, a key component of this is actually a negotiation with the United States and with other Western countries to provide security commitments. They're not able to get guarantees at this stage, but to backstop the agreement, right? An insurance policy of some kind. Third, for Ukraine to have a confidence that there is going to be a some sort of locked-in long-term support so that the Ukrainian military can be maintained at a level sufficient to defend against a future Russian invasion, right? That's a third issue involved in this, because the Ukrainian military, as you see it today, is a mobilized military for this war. It is not a sustainable peacetime military. You can't imagine if peace were to break out right now, as a previous questioner asked, this military would require a lot of support, or some military sufficient to defend Russia, and that would be beyond Ukraine's economic means. Lastly, the challenge for Ukraine had been, from my point of view, has not been so much how do you liberate specific parts of territory, it's how do you attain the right leverage over Russia on the battlefield to then achieve their political aims. The theory had been, at least behind the previous offensive, right? As I said, there's a debate and there are dilemmas about what to do in the future, but we can at least look to the past. It had been to break through to the south, right, in order to hold Crimea at risk, under the assumption that Russia holds Crimea as much more politically valuable than the other parts of territory that they've occupied, and to use that as leverage, right, to achieve the other aims or goals that the Ukrainian leadership has, right? And at least this was a workable thesis, I think, based on the resources available, right, and what could have been achieved in 2023. And I think that's one of the challenge of can you make that thesis work again? Do you have to come up with another vision or plan? But to me, I don't think Ukraine should be, or is likely to be willing to make major territorial concessions, nor do I think that would settle it either, right? So the way I look at this issue is a bit different.
So is regaining Crimea out of the question?
I don't know. I'll be honest. It's a question of timelines. I don't know if anything's out of the question, but I think the priority is leverage, and how you establish leverage can be in liberating territory. It can be in inflicting, right, a decisive defeat, or it can be holding at risk something that your opponent values much more politically than other things, and essentially having that threat being sufficient that if they are losing, and I think they're going to lose more, then they might be willing to either negotiate or capitulate on the rest, right? At least there are competing theses. I myself, like I said, it's hard for me to advance a theory that's completely different from what the Ukrainian public position is. Ukrainian public position is, liberate all territory back to 1991 borders, repatriation of all the folks that are under occupation and the folks and the kids that Russia essentially kidnapped into Russia, and of course payment of compensation. The rest I probably can't enumerate all the demands, but what I listed at least was a reasonable theory that I thought was working, was the working theory for the military strategy being pursued.
Robbie, if I
Well,
may,
thank you very much. Chip, back to you.
okay, great, thank you. I've got a couple of questions. The first one, Carl Kilhofer, one of our board members, asks about the performance in the Russian Black Sea. We're particularly concerned about this, the successes and the significance of what's going on in the Black Sea. Could you talk about the Black Sea, Russian Black Sea fleet and what's going on there and the impact?
Yeah, sure. So, the Black Sea fleet was more or less cornered and pushed out of the western part of the Black Sea a year ago, and Ukraine's had successes with strikes against the Black Sea fleet, both using fairly traditional weapons like air-launched cruise missiles, but also various types of drones that they have developed. There's a competition between Ukraine's SBU and who are military intelligence and strikes against the Russian Black Sea fleet. So it's been probably the bright spot on the course of Ukraine operations last year. And it's to some extent enabled, I think, a degree of mutual deterrence where both sides have shied away from attacking port infrastructure, commercial shipping, and it significantly reopened commercial shipping for Ukraine late last year to the point that that shipping now in volume significantly exceeds that which was conducted under the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And I won't say it's now at pre-war levels, but it's a lot closer to that, meaning that's been fairly significant. And from that point of view, I would say that Ukraine had used both the capabilities provided by the West, and I'm sure targeting assistance as well, right? We often kind of, I'd say, the conversation elides the degree of Western support that may or may not be involved in some of these operations. But most importantly, it proved quite effective at establishing a degree of sea control and sea denial in the part of the Black Sea that's most important for commercial shipping for Ukraine. And restoring that access has strategic effects on Ukraine's economic viability, right? So if I go back to those earlier points of saying one of the big pieces of the puzzle is Ukraine not having to surrender sovereignty, not having the war end in any way where Russia gets to impose its will on Ukraine, but also most importantly, not having the war progress such that Russia feels that's actually succeeding in strategy to destroy Ukraine's economic viability.
Chip, let me piggyback on that, and I'll come right back to you.
Right.
Michael, as a former naval person, I think you know I am a former naval person. How do you explain the abysmal performance of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea?
Okay, well, all right, there's some nuances there, Robbie. So as a person who's not a former naval person, but was director of a research program at Center for Naval Analysis, so we know each other for some years. So first, Black Sea Fleet. So the initial performance of the Black Sea Fleet at the opening of the war, I actually don't think it was that poor. The Black Sea Fleet conducted an outer blockade. Naval infantry embarked, and so they had like an amphibious force in being, even though they had nowhere to land and no successful ground force operation to link up with. But they were effective in the first month in forcing Ukrainian military to hold units in reserve, right, to hedge against a landing in Odessa. After that, the Black Sea Fleet, one, didn't have that much to do besides conducting cruise missile strikes, right, in Ukraine and supporting that. And they have a fairly small amount of fires to contribute relative to the rest of the Russian military. And secondarily, they got pretty lazy real fast, I would say. They did not take the Ukrainian military seriously as a threat until the Moskva got sunk by coastal defense cruise missiles. So how do we expect this poor performance? First, the leadership isn't very good. Second, they've consistently failed to take anticipatory action, and so often they've gotten shellacked before changing how they operate. I think that Ukraine introduced some new capabilities that they definitely weren't set up or prepared to deal with, like various types of sea skimming drones, which actually a lot of militaries are not necessarily all that well prepared, to be perfectly honest, and don't necessarily have the right TTPs don't have the right harbor defense. We've seen a lot of adaptation to that on the Russian Navy side. Lastly, it's not really clear what the Black Sea Fleet is there to do at this point. It's sort of, it represents a threat in being, but in practice, it's clear that they are not conducting attacks against commercial shipping. There isn't a Ukrainian Navy per se for them to fight with. And like most ships, they're going to lose they're going to lose any battle with the shore. Okay. And the Black Sea in particular is a fairly confined space. And if you're a rather dated fleet, keep in mind that the Black Sea Fleet until 2014, about 10 years ago, was generally described as a sort of floating museum of Soviet naval shipbuilding from 1970s, which is fair. As a fairly dated fleet, I don't think that the Black Sea Fleet had that much that it could do, to be frank. And other than running LST runs back and forth to help resupply, there again is also an issue. Ships in port are very vulnerable to strikes. They're very vulnerable to things like air-launched cruise missiles, SRBMs, and all these types of weapons have been used against the Black Sea Fleet. And no air defense or missile defense is impervious. I think in some areas, Russian air defense probably performed poorly than they expected in being able to shield the rest of the fleet when it's docked. But yeah, I think a fair amount of the losses there that they've had have been to traditional conventional weapons. So yeah, the performance has been quite poor. I think that's very fair to say. That's certainly after the first month of the war. And their overall contribution has not been that significant. I think some areas are novel and worth looking at, particularly the use of drones, how to defend them, and Ukrainian innovation in these types of attacks. Because to be frank, we will have to deal with them too, right? This is the future for us as well. And you can lose a very expensive ship real fast. Some of the other things are just good reminders, meaning old enduring lessons relearned. Ships are vulnerable in port. Harbor defense is a big deal. You're going to have to have practices, TTPs, and you're going to have to take your opponents seriously. And I think Russians consistently failed to do that when it came to Ukrainian capabilities.
Good answer. I'll borrow your term, shambolic. You described the Russian military during the early months of the war as shambolic.
Yep.
Well, the Russian army appears to have improved a lot, but I don't see that kind of improvement from the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. But let's move beyond that. Chip, back to you.
Great. And if you don't mind, with due respect to Zev Lavon, Stephen Shore, Thomas Bitter, and Reed Harrison, I'm going to ask you, Michael, to put your Ukraine hat on. We've got about a number of questions that all revolve around the perspective from Ukraine. And they are as follows. To what degree is Putin fighting this war under the influence of Kirill, the head of the church? Is the state of the Ukraine public opinion on the war and on President Zelensky good or bad? And by the way, the same question become true of Russia as well. And then the last question is, why have Kaliningrad and Minsk not been Ukrainian targets? So a perspective on the role of public opinion, the specific targets, and the personal opinions of the Russia derivations of their goal and strategies.
Okay, so on Kirill, head of the church, my answer is no. The church, I think, in Russia is much more an instrument of the state than the state is an instrument of the church. And the church forms kind of one of the instruments with which Russian leadership tries to create a national idea. But I see that relationship as being one directional, and the direction is much more from the state to the church than the other way around.
All right, thank you.
Public opinion in Ukraine. So I'll be frank, I don't follow it that closely, but my general view is that first, Ukraine is a democracy. It's very much an imperfect democracy, but it is a democracy. A Ukrainian political leadership does tend to hew towards public opinion and follow it quite closely, right? Ukraine as a democracy is a bit distinct, not unique, but distinct in that incumbents don't enjoy a lot of advantages as they typically do in democracies. In Ukraine, it's not uncommon for the incumbent president to be voted out, to be defeated by the challenger, whereas in most democracies, the leader who's in power enjoys a lot of advantages by virtue of the fact that they're in power. And so because of that, the political leadership is even more sensitive to public opinion because in Ukraine, majorities in parliament can shift fairly quickly and people can change parties fairly quickly as well. That's not the case right now in wartime. There are no elections and MPs can't get elected. And I think by law, they also can't even resign. It's sort of like frozen in place as the Ukrainian Rada. But nonetheless, there's an understanding that public opinion in the absence of elections is a measure of implicit legitimacy, right? Since there's no procedural mechanism right now to renew legitimacy, there are still measures that implicitly convey legitimacy. And Ukrainian leadership, because of that, is going to be reticent to engage in the sort of compromise or concessions that folks discussed earlier that would represent domestic political suicide, right? And historical patterns have shown before clearly that wars may continue for quite some time if there isn't, a good way to win to end it necessarily. Leaders don't see a way out either, and they are unwilling to make concessions because the public's not willing to make concessions, right? And they are there to represent the public. The third question, can you remind me?
Sure. The targets of Kaliningrad and Minsk, or the lack of targeting of Kaliningrad and Minsk.
Well, I'm not sure what to make of that question. Kaliningrad's a Russian enclave. Minsk.
Why wouldn't Ukraine make them be targets?
Oh, why would Ukraine make them a target? So, okay. Well, first, Ukrainian military intelligence has conducted, I believe, some very minor operations. Remember one that was a drone strike against a Russian aircraft in Belarus about a year plus ago. But yeah, in general, they've not been conducting strikes there. I think the reason for that is straightforward. First, there's no reason to target Kaliningrad. The entire 11th Corps from Kaliningrad is currently conducting offensive operations in Kharkiv. So, meaning all the Russian corps and most of the Russian military is currently either on Ukrainian territory or on Ukrainian borders, along with most of the capabilities involved. You don't have to go to Kaliningrad to fight the 11th Corps. It's currently conducting a cross-border offensive into Kharkiv along with 44th. Regarding Minsk, well, it's clear that Ukraine, while seeing Belarus as a material party to the war, right, as like the Platzdarm from where Russian forces are based, from where Russia conducted the invasion, conducts strikes and sorties and what have you, is not willing to turn Belarusian public opinion and basically make Lukashenko's job much easier by conducting strikes in Belarus, if that makes any sense, right? Like I think Ukrainian leadership understands that their problem is the personalist authoritarian regime in Russia and the personalist authoritarian regime in Belarus, but not necessarily the Belarusian people, and it wouldn't do much good to make it politically easy for Lukashenko to mobilize either public opinion or the military behind stronger support of Russia's effort, right? Since Belarusian, I think, opinion is generally opposed Belarus entering the war in a more meaningful way.
Right. And to that same point, if I can follow on real quickly, one of the questions asked about the attack missiles that have been U.S. sent to the Ukraine, how they fit in the war effort and the consideration of using U.S. weapons to target Russia itself. And then the second part of the question is the air support component of Western military aid appears to be muted at the moment. When things change with the F-16s sort of making their combat presence?
Okay, the question on strikes, I mean, it's a complicated one, depends on what you're talking about. I think in general, Western long-range precision strike capabilities were quite effective when they were first introduced. Like most capabilities in a war, they are most effective when they are first introduced onto the battlefield at scale. Then they drive a cycle of adaptation and development of counters. So they were successful. They were particularly successful early on the summer of 2022. However, over time, Russian forces adapted. They developed counters. And after some time, their effectiveness had degraded significantly, much more so for precision-guided artillery shells, less so, but still notably for Gimlers fired by HIMARS systems. And to be frank, we've introduced capabilities at a fairly small scale over a long period of time stretched out. So it has given Russia the opportunity to basically go through these cycles. And I think at no point were they able to help Ukraine establish a decisive advantage on the battlefield. Although I think it's quite arguable that they would have in the first place. But if you look at the hundreds of Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles used, ATACMS most recently has been effective, but in the numbers employed, it's certainly not made the difference. But to be clear, I have a strong bias on this myself as an analyst. One, I don't believe in game-changing capabilities. I don't believe in Wunderwaffen in war. I just don't. I think conventional wars very much are about attrition. They're about being able to reconstitute the force. They're about whether you can operate at scale and sustain combat operations at scale. They're about defense industrial mobilization. What they're not about is coming up with the latest wonder weapon. And even if you do, it's going to give you a limited advantage for a fairly short period of time in a prolonged conventional war. And maybe you'll be able to capitalize it in one specific operation and make use of it, or maybe you won't. But none of these things compensate for the fundamentals. If you don't have manpower, if you don't have like sustainment and good maintenance logistics, right? If you can't employ forces at scale, if you don't have the enablers or other things you need to overcome prepared defense, none of these things are individually going to make that difference. On the F-16 question, so I think my answer is, first, it depends. That's a disappointing answer, but it depends on what the F-16s are actually armed with, what kind of upgrades they're provided with. The F-16s that Europeans are providing, which are F-16s they're getting out of so they can get into F-35s, are a pretty dated system, okay? It's without the latest generation AIM-120s, without upgraded radars. It's not that great of a system. The best it's going to do is it will allow easy integration with other Western capabilities, various standoff strike missiles, anti-ship missiles, what have you, assuming those are provided, right? But Ukraine is going to get F-16s in fairly limited quantities, and they're going to have a pretty steep learning curve in operating them and maintaining them, okay? Going from MiG-29, C-27 to F-16 is not easy. It's one thing to go from one Soviet platform to another. It's another thing to go from a Soviet platform to a Western platform with a different design philosophy and different approach to operation maintenance sustainment. Ukraine has to refurbish several airfields specifically for the use of F-16 because F-16 is not going to land on the air bases they currently have. So all these things are going to come into play, meaning it'll make a difference, but I'm not looking for it to be any kind of decisive factor this year. And lastly, look, the Ukrainian military, like the Russian military, are militaries that are successors of the Soviet military, right? Which is a fires-driven army that culturally is an artillery army and is very much dominated by land forces general staff. And as a force, neither the Russian military nor the Ukrainian military, which heavily sort of, let's say, oriented towards denial of opponent air power via ground-based air defense. Like the chief of the Ukrainian Air Force is from the air defense component of the service. So is the chief of the Russian aerospace forces as well, right? I'm not saying that if you just look at the individual and what service component they're from, that's going to tell you a lot. But it does tell you some things, okay? And so the reality is it'll take quite a while for Ukraine to evolve the tactics to go from 2-ship tactics to 4-ship and be able to conduct the kind of operations as you see Western Air Forces. That's going to be a very significant evolution as well, right? So often folks assume that you're transferring the capability of the platform, right? But integrating air-ground force operations is much harder than just even doing combined arms. There's a lot that goes into that. And to be frank, a lot of Western militaries can't do it all that well. Most expectations on what an Air Force can do, if you look at what it's based on, a lot of it's based on either U.S. combat performance or Israeli combat performance. but it's not even based on the performance of a lot of Western militaries. So I'm tampering down expectations. I think Ukraine getting F-16s is a great thing, but it's going to be a multi-year transition. It'll require time and resourcing, and also a lot depends on what we provide them to employ with that F-16 as well. And so there's a lot of question marks there yet for me. Sorry, this is a long answer about just F-16s, but might as well get the air power conversation out.
We appreciate this answer.
A great answer, Michael. Thank you much. I believe our staff member Saul has a question. Saul, are you still there?
Yes, I am, but I think Mr. Kofman actually answered the question a little while ago, namely about like what are the implications of the people who are trapped behind enemy lines in Russia, and particularly if the human rights situations that are happening back there, and what that kind of means to the general Ukrainian public.
Yeah, well, just to restrike that target, I think the short answer is, look, Ukrainian. I don't think the Ukrainian public or the Ukrainian political leadership is going to abandon these people or formally recuse themselves either from the territory or the demand for repatriation of Ukrainian nationals, and that's where things stand.
Good.
Can I jump in, Bobby?
I noticed that our president, Roy Gutman, apparently has dialed in from Kosovo, 6 or 7 time zones removed. Roy, are you with us? Do you have a question? I take that as a no. Sleep well, Roy. Where are you?
Here I am. Here I am back on. Well, if you look at our daily blog on Ukraine, then the Ukrainians list the casualties of the Russian side each day, and they now estimate, and it's their estimate, that the Russians have lost as many as 500,000 soldiers in the fighting. Namely, this is both killed and wounded. And it's a staggering number. And at earlier points in the estimates that they've put out, the British have basically come up with similar figures. Well, whatever the figures, how long can Russia keep this up?
Okay, so first on lost, I'm not a big fan of that as a category. Just speaking as an analyst, I prefer total casualties, right? As you said, killed, wounded, missing in action. I think that estimate is fair, probably somewhere 450 to 500,000 total. Second, it is a staggering number, and it's more than the Russian military has lost in war since World War II, probably all of them combined. Third, it's not a staggering number compared to losses in any particular battle in World War II, which is the cultural reference point for a lot of people in Russia and the Russian military. How long can Russia keep this up? The answer is unfortunately one that's dependent on much more than just manpower casualties. If the issue came down just to manpower, my answer would be quite a long time, for a very simple reason, that manpower is not the central constraint that Russia seems to be operating right now. Right, that may not hold true for next year. We have to caveat that we're basing our assumptions on what's been happening in the war so far. But most of these individuals today are those who are willing to accept money to go fight in Ukraine. They are contracted, some from prisons, but most not. And insofar as long as Russians are willing to take money to go fight in Ukraine, which they are, they will be able to regenerate enough of their losses and be able to create additional combat formations. And so the greater limiting factor on Russia next year probably is equipment more than casualties to personnel. And secondarily, I think constraints and balancing all macroeconomic constraints and balancing all this on the economy. Meaning, I think that they probably could muddle through for some time, but if they're not if they're not winning, if they've not established any sort of momentum this year, and the challenge becomes much greater for Russia next year, and if they're not on track to achieve any of the Russian aims in this war next year, then the reality is that their likelihood of attaining any sort of success. And to be clear, even that for me is very dubious, because whatever they do achieve, this war probably will be seen historically still as a strategic failure for Russia in many respects, given the initial war aims, given the cost they've paid and the long-term costs that they haven't paid yet. But nonetheless, then the odds of Russian success become much lower. So the issue isn't how long Russia can sustain this, from my point of view. Although it's a great question, right? I think the question is, how long can Russia reasonably hope to maintain an advantage, right? And at what point does their advantage relative to their goals begin to decrease? And Ukraine can potentially, if not regain the initiative, then at the very least regain significant leverage in the conversation, right? Meaning not be in a position where it has to deal with Russians from a point of weakness, but increasingly from one of strength, right? But yeah, the casualties are high, but I have to tell you that it actually also says, a bit about us, that yeah, we see these casualties as unsustainable. And I've actually heard this over the last not 2.5, but almost 2.5 years from folks here in the US. And I think there's a strong feeling of appreciation that large-scale conventional wars, they go on beyond the initial period of war, are going to involve very high rates of losses, and they are sustainable for large countries, and they are going to be sustained. And you often get the question of how long can the other opponent go on, and the answer is people typically underestimate their opponent's ability to withstand attrition, and also often underestimate their own. Russians grossly underestimate how long Ukraine can sustain this. Ukraine has been able to sustain this, despite the fact that they too have had fairly high losses on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Michael, thank you. Chip, is there one more question from the virtual audience?
Oh boy. If I have to make it one question, I'd have to combine a couple. My apologies, Thomas Devaney, who had a good question about the Budapest Memorandum.
You make a Frankenstein question?
Yeah, I'm going to try to
sew it together.
And the combination is really one between a question that Hal Kassoff had asked, and one that Fontaine Bell asked. The subject is the long term. Kassoff's question was about if Trump wins and pulls back U.S. support, can our European allies provide sufficient support for Ukraine to hold the allies, to hold the line against the Russians? And Fontaine said, what are the objectives and strategy of the European members of NATO vis-a-vis the Ukraine war? So I'll lump those into one question if I can.
Okay. Yeah, Trump pulling back support. What can Europeans do without the United States? And then European strategy.
Yeah.
Okay. So first, a couple points on the table. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of what's going to happen in this war is likely to be determined this year and by how this year goes. Okay, which is, I want folks to keep in mind that yes, the election is important, but whoever is president in January will inherit a situation and a trajectory, right? And that trajectory is going to be not locked in, but fairly set. We are where we are in the war right now because of decisions that were made in 2022 in practice. And 2025 will be heavily determined by what we do or don't do this year, right? Does Ukraine stabilize the front? Are we on the path in the next 6 months to rebuild the Ukrainian military and reconstitute? Because if we're not, then the options for what can be done in 2025 are not a debate. They almost become moot because you're locked into what you have to work with. So I want to first convey that the options will be limited, I think, for Trump administration either way. Second, we have the supplemental that's been passed, but it's also not clear that there's going to be another supplemental of the size passed again. In fact, I'm a bit skeptical on that, right? So that expectation is already out there and depending on who's president, right? Now, basically what I'm trying to say is far less depends on the administration changing and who's actually president next January than people think. A lot depends on what happens between now and January next year. If Trump pulls back support, yes, Europeans can compensate to a degree, but they will be significantly constrained in providing munitions, which will be very important, both for artillery and air defense. They'll be in much better shape than they are now, but nonetheless, there's a whole host of things the United States provides that they will struggle to replace. And I think that'll be pretty much it for provision of equipment. And I don't know where we're going to shake out on provision of intelligence support. The U.S. right now is trying to push some of these efforts from a U.S.-led coalition framework to a NATO framework, right? And you can see that policy folks are probably trying to, or at least thinking that they're trying to Trump-proof some of these efforts. I suspect that's what's going on. I'm not saying that's what I've heard. I'm just sort of suspecting that that's probably what's behind efforts to shift us more towards NATO, towards these framework. But so it depends to some extent how much of this is actually taken over by Europeans over the next 6 months, because so far most of this has been a U.S.-led effort, right? That's coordinated by SAGU under EUCOM, Security Assistance Group Ukraine under EUCOM, with support and help from a lot of allies. Okay, but bottom line is it'll be hard. I don't think that the floor is going to fall out from under Ukraine, but in key munitions categories and other things, Europeans just won't be able to replace it very easily. All right, last, European strategy. Well, that's a really great question. So it depends on who you ask in Europe, right? You know, the challenge in Europe, as Kissinger said long ago, if I want to talk to Europe, who do I call? So it depends on who you choose to call in Europe. I think that the views in Europe vary. It's become interesting to see as you know, U.S. did it on a supplemental, that some countries had been more forward-leaning in rhetoric, obviously like Macron and British. But the interesting question is, will there be follow-through? Will there be follow-through and independent action by European countries? So far, I've not yet seen it. So I think that European countries are signaling that even without the United States, they're certainly not willing to let Ukraine collapse. They're trying to create strategic ambiguity, at least France is. I doubt that that's going to work because you have to show things. You can't just talk about them. So you have to actually show that you're willing to send trainers. You have to show that you're willing to invest. You have to show that you're actually going to issue multi-year contracts for ammunition production or production of air defense systems and the like. So a lot of it's not about gesticulating, but much more about making the physical movements to indicate that you're actually vested in the war. So that's my view on it. I think that leading European countries will come closer to a strategy the closer they think that they might be facing another Trump administration. Is that a reasonable answer? That's my guess. It's my best guess. I'm not an expert on Europe necessarily, but that's my best guess. But the closer that looms, the harder they'll be thinking about what their strategy looks like.
Yeah. Michael, we have bumped up against the bewitching hour, but I've got to ask you one. Given that you just asked you posed the Kissinger question, who do you call in Europe? So let's say you're Tony Blinken today. Who does he call Germany? Does he call France? If he had picked one, whom should he call?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, you know, I'm always reticent. I'll give you my bias to this answer. I'm always reticent to say France. We already talk to the British every day. Okay, so if we're going to call somebody, my guess probably would be either Germany or Poland. I think the real issue is gaining traction and steadily shifting the views in Germany. I know it's been the hardest, right? Because although Germany has provided a great deal in terms of military assistance, much more than I think is commonly believed, and in many cases much more than France, they've been hard-nosed on a host of policy issues and things they've been unwilling to do. But they're gonna have to change their policy on those things if the United States is no longer able to support Ukraine the way we have been over the last 2.5 years, right? That's going to be It's going to be the reality.
Hey, Robbie,
Right.
can I ask two questions?
Michael, before we say thank you, inquiring minds want to know, who is that person in that painting over your right shoulder?
Yeah, the question comes up on occasion. So, my short answer is it's either not who you think it is, or it is who you think it is, which is this is a picture of Patrick Stewart, who you may know as Jean-Luc Picard, in the garb of a general from the Napoleonic War period. Okay. If that's what you were guessing, you were right. If that's not what you were guessing, then, take a look again. And it's the intersection of my two interests, right? Military history and obviously Star Trek.
Perfect.
Well, Michael, let me, on behalf of the members of our council and certainly our board of trustees, thank you for the briefing and discussion this evening. What we have learned over the past nearly 2.5 years, as you say, is if we want to have an honest assessment, an honest, objective assessment of what's going on in this war, the person we want to talk with is Michael Kofman. Michael, we can't thank you enough, and please know that you have an open invitation to speak with us again anytime you wish. So on behalf of, again, the members of the council and certainly our board of trustees, thank you so very, very much for this evening. We very much appreciate it.
Well, thanks a lot for engaging with me, for the great questions, and it's always good to be back talking with you again. I'm sure we'll have another opportunity before long.